Okay, there we go. Okay, so this actually is the last of our lessons in our section on science. So we did an overview of science. We looked at what science was, what science can do, and the limitations of science and scientific knowledge. We talked about the kind of the origins or the foundation of modern science today. What we think of as modern science, which of course began in particularly the 16th and 17th centuries, and how that was rooted. How contemporary science, modern science, is an outgrowth of a Christian worldview. So we saw that science and Christianity are not in conflict. There are areas within science in which there's some tension, but overall, science grows out of a Christian worldview, the sense of an orderly world created by an orderly God, that sort of thing. That science grew in the West out of a Christian worldview and did not develop anywhere else in the world. It grew and developed out of that Christian worldview. So, and then of course we talked about origins. We've been talking about origins for several weeks: the origin of the cosmos, the origin of life, the origin of the species, and then last week, of course, we talked about the origin of the human race. So now today I want to switch gears in our last lesson on science and talk about the issue of miracles. And then next week, we'll move into our next module, which I call the authority module, which has to do with just the authority of Scripture. All the questions that come up about the Bible. Why do we believe it's the Word of God? Is it historically trustworthy? Can we trust the text? Do we have reliable copies of the text? What about the phenomena of biblical criticism? What's called biblical criticism. And there are various versions of biblical criticism, and we want to think about those. So there's just a whole lot of things. So we'll spend I think about 4 or 5 weeks just on the Bible, the authority, the reliability, and the authorship, the divine authorship of the Bible. So those are things that we have coming up. But today we do want to talk about miracles in science. And if you printed up your notes, you should have this in your notes. But again, I have a list there of resources for you. Eric Metaxas has written this very, very helpful book just entitled Miracles. Eric Metaxas is a New York Times bestseller with some of his other books. He's a tremendous writer. But in his book, Miracles, he wrestles with some of the questions that we're going to be wrestling with today and in the early part of the book. And then he spends a number of chapters just recounting miracles that have happened in the lives of people he knows. So these are not just third hand or fourth hand, but these are actual people that he personally knows, and he relates the story of the miracles they've experienced in their life, as well as 1 or 2 that he experienced in his own life. It's a very readable, very enjoyable book. John Lennox, who is of course the Oxford mathematician and philosopher and outstanding Christian apologist, who has written a couple books in which he deals with the question of miracles. One is God's Undertaker, and the other is Gunning for God. Both very readable books written at the popular level. Norman Geisler and Ronald Brooks have written a book which is kind of a general apologetics book, but they have a good substantial section on the subject of miracles in their book, When Skeptics Ask. And then Norman Geisler has also written the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. And I think I've mentioned this book before, but I want to stress, this is a tremendous, if you're only going to have one book in your library on Christian apologetics, this is probably the one to have, because it's literally an encyclopedia. So there's just many different articles about many different aspects of apologetics. If you have a question about almost any question related to apologetics, somebody you're talking to brings up a question, you can go to the encyclopedia and look up, and you get some tremendous resources. The books, I don't remember exactly when it's published. It's been several years now, so there are some new discoveries and new things to add to it, but it's just a tremendous resource. And then a book I'm going to refer to, a work work I'm going to refer to today several times is Greg Keener's book, or actually 2-volume work entitled Miracles. Keener was a missionary for a number of years overseas, but he's also an outstanding academic, tremendous researcher, and he has written one of the definitive works on miracles. And he literally documents, I don't know how many, I would say in his book, in his 2 volumes, I would at least 1,000, if not more than 1,000 miracles throughout history and up into the present century, and all over the world. And then William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith, also has a tremendous section on miracles. So those are just some resources for you. So now, some of you are too young to remember this, but when I post this picture,
I just saw the movie.
What does that remind you people of? What? Now, like I say, some of you may be too young to remember this, but some of us are old enough to remember it. What is that?
Well, I just saw the movie 2 days ago, Miracle on Ice, the Olympics.
Okay. When was it?
Now it's in the 80s.
Yeah, it's 1980. That's right. And the U.S. Olympic team, which was not really considered to be that great of a team, entered the Olympics. They were expected to be eliminated early on, and they ended up defeating Russia, who were expected to be the Olympic champions that year, defeated them in the semifinal round, and then of course went on to beat Canada in the finals game and win the gold medal. But this picture was taken right after they had defeated the Russians, and Katie's right, it's called the Miracle on Ice, right? Now,
yes, sir.
The question is, I've got for you, was that a miracle?
I don't think so, because it was all based on human discipline and focus and strategy.
Okay.
I think for the United States, it was a big deal, but when we compare it to what Jesus did, turning like water into wine, that's a miracle.
Okay. That's good discernment. And, of course, we look at it as a miracle here in America. I'm not sure the Russians view it as a miracle. But this illustrates something that I think we need to be cognizant of as Christians, is that we often use the word miracle in kind of a cavalier or kind of a generic sense to talk about anything that's just kind of really cool and wonderful, but really unusual and unexpected, okay? And I think when we use the word miracle in that way, it tends to diminish in people's minds the sense of things that are, then the significance of the things that really truly are miraculous. So I would encourage you as a Christian and as an apologist, when you're interacting with people, to really avoid using the word unless it's really appropriate. Lennox, in his book, Gunning for God, says this. He says, the only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles, he means kill it in people's minds, make people so think that miracles aren't possible. He says, the only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles more quickly than a committed materialism is the claiming of miracle status for everyday events for which natural explanations are readily at hand. And so, just talking about the so-called miracle on ice, Katie's right. It wasn't a miracle. It's completely explicable by naturalistic terms, human discipline, concentration, and that sort of thing. So I think it would help if we avoid using the word except when it's really appropriate. And this kind of brings up the question of unusual events. What kind of unusual events are there out there that sometimes people think of as being maybe miraculous or whatever? And Mary and I had the opportunity to listen to Frank Turek. Actually, I've heard him several times, but this was a talk he gave up in Oklahoma City at a church in Oklahoma City. Mary and I listened to, in which he gave a talk on miracles, and he gave a helpful list of different kinds of unusual events. And I think it helps us to think through them. And the first is what he called anomalies. So what we would think of as freaks of nature, okay? And these are, of course, always highly unusual events, but the source of them, the power behind them is a natural power, okay? So you think of something like an albino frog or a 7-foot-tall basketball player. These would be anomalies. They're not usual, but they are naturally explicable. The second category would be things like magic or illusions, okay? And here again, the source is human. The traits are they really seem to be kind of unnatural events, but they are man-controlled. And of course, now in the West, magicians practicing in the West are always usually very open about, that this is totally something they're doing. It's human-controlled. But historically, of course, magic has often been used to mimic miracles. So we need to keep that distinction in mind. So, of course, the rabbit in the hat, card tricks, things like that. But also, if you've watched, magic shows, they can get some pretty sophisticated and pretty cool magic and tricks, but they are still totally human powered, okay? And then we have psychosomatic events. And again, here the power is human, but it has to do primarily with the human mind. Oftentimes we think of psychosomatic as related to illnesses, but you can also have sometimes you can have positive things, human feats of human strength and things like this that are the result of psychosomatic events, okay? So they're highly unusual. They may at times appear to be supernatural, but they actually emanate from just a high, some people call it faith, but what it really is just an intense mental concentration, okay? And not everybody can do this. Some people can, some people can't. It depends on their ability to really focus and concentrate the mind to be able to focus their energies and their capabilities. The fourth is satanic activity or demonic activity. Of course, the power behind it is evil, it's demonic. The traits are that, of course, it is evil or it's related to evil. It communicates some kind of false message, typically related to the occult, has very limited usefulness, but very extraordinary events, okay? An example, of course, would be the strength of the demoniac in Mark chapter 5, where he's able literally to break chains, okay? And that appears to be really a demonic thing that's going on. Now, I want to make clear at this point that there are some satanic activities in the New Testament that the New Testament uses the same word to describe them as the word that is translated miracles. So in some cases, these are called miracles, okay? But in our discussion today, I'm not going to include those in my discussion of miracles. I'll explain more about that in a minute. Then we switch over to the divinely caused unusual events. And there are two categories. One is providence. And providence is just prearranged events, okay? The power is divine, but they're naturally explained. And we have a number of those in scripture and in life. So for example, people often talk about the fog that settled in over the Allied ships at Normandy during the D-Day invasion. And it was a tremendous advantage to the Allies. It gave us an element of surprise we wouldn't have otherwise had. And many historians, particularly Christian historians and other Christians, attribute that fog to God, to divine act. But it was not a miracle. It's completely naturalistically explained. And a classic example from scripture, of course, is this whole story of Esther. And when you read the book of Esther, you realize God is not mentioned in the entire book. So in the entire book of Esther, God is not mentioned. But you read the book of Esther and you walk away with this sense of what? God was at work. God was doing things, okay? So everything that happens in the book of Esther is naturalistically explainable. And yet very clearly the message of Esther is God is at work. So Mordecai asks Esther, or says to Esther at one point, he says, who knows but what you attained the throne for such a time as this?
Yes,
And if
yes.
you don't do what you're supposed to do, something will arise from somewhere else. Of course, he doesn't name God there. He doesn't specify that it's divine, but clearly that's the implication. So these would be examples of God's providence. And Christian theologians frequently speak of the providence of God at work. Okay? And then the final category is miracles, what we think of as miracles. And these are divine acts, as I'm using the term today. The power behind them, of course, is supernatural, so it supersedes the normal laws and the capabilities and the causality that we see in nature. And Turek points out that it never fails, it's immediate, it's enduring, and it gives glory to God. Now, that's, like I said, I got this list from Turek, and it's very helpful. He does make this point about miracles being immediate. And incidentally, Ronnie, in one of his sermons several months ago, he was talking on miracles, makes the same point that when Jesus did miracles, the healing was always immediate. But I'm not completely sure about that. In Keener's book, he documents a number of miracles that weren't instantaneous. They happened over a period of time, hours or even a few days. So I'm not sure if I would embrace the idea that miracles are always immediate, but that certainly is a position that many take, including, as I understand it, Ronnie takes that position. So of course, examples of miracles would be raising the dead, Elisha raising the axe head, the iron axe head that had fallen in the water, Jesus healing of withered hands. So these are, of course, many, many other miracles. So these are all categories of unusual events, but what we're focusing on today is miracles, and we want to be careful to distinguish them from these other categories, okay? And so before I give you kind of my definition of miracles or how we're going to work with it today, it would be helpful just to have a little bit of history. So there are several individuals who have been particularly influential in how we as Westerners tend to think about miracles. And the first was a Dutch philosopher by the name of Spinoza from the 17th century. And he argued that miracles were impossible. Of course, he's in that early age of modern science, and we're discovering natural law and that sort of thing. So that's one of his reasons why he believes that miracles are impossible. But the other reason was he was a pantheist. And you remember from our study of worldview that pantheists view all of reality as one. So God and nature are one. And so for Spinoza, it was impossible to think of something happening other than by the laws of nature, because the nature is God and God is nature. And so to him, it was just incomprehensible that it would be like God contradicting himself. And so to him, miracles were impossible. And then following in the next century, you have the profoundly influential, as Spinoza was, but profoundly influential philosopher, Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume. We've talked about him before when we looked at arguments for the existence of God. And of course, he argued strongly against God's existence. But he's very highly regarded, and for good reason in a number of areas. But he also argued that miracles are by definition a violation of the laws of nature. And so they could not occur. And he basically had kind of two lines of argument. But before I go into this, let me just mention this definition of his: a violation of the laws of nature. We'll come back to that. But I think it's important that we avoid that definition. It's really counterproductive when we're trying to talk to people about the possibility of miracles. And you'll see why in a minute. So Hume basically had two arguments. He had what's called an in principle argument, and they had an in fact argument. And in his in principle argument, he argued that even if somebody had just kind of overwhelming proof that a miracle had occurred, you still shouldn't believe that it had. And the reason being that he's saying no matter how much evidence you had, no matter how much testimony, reliable testimony, and all that you had on one side saying the miracle had, you have on the other side all the array of the regularity of nature since the beginning of nature. So in his mind, all the regularity of nature, the constancy of nature, the laws of nature, and the fact that they are never violated overwhelms any evidence, no matter how much evidence. He called it full proof. So if you have full proof for a miracle, you shouldn't believe it because you have an overwhelming amount of evidence on the other side that nature doesn't do that, okay? And this leads to his in fact argument, okay? And in his in fact argument, he says, really, in fact, it would be impossible to find any kind of proof like that. And the reason for that is, he says, only primitive and barbarous people believe in miracles. So only kind of pre-scientific, before we knew the laws of nature, those are the only kind of people who believe in miracles, okay? And miracle claims run counter to what he called the universal human experience. So he said, universal human experience is that nature always acts in this way. So if you have some kind of barbaric person or pre-scientific or anti-scientific person that says they've seen a miracle, you can just dismiss that, because we know that universal human experience is that nature always acts according to these laws and causation and that sort of thing, okay? And then shortly after him comes along Paley, and he was a theologian and a philosopher, and he argues strongly against Hume, and he argues strongly against Spinoza, but particularly against Hume. And he counters Hume's argument about universal human experience, and his argument basically is that begs the question. It's a circular argument. So that what Hume is arguing is we have universal human experience that miracles don't happen, and so we shouldn't accept the testimony of people who testify to miracles because we know miracles don't happen. So it basically ends up being a circular argument, or what's called begging the question. Okay, so let me now at this point really kind of define what are we talking about today in this lesson when we're talking about a miracle. Keener gives what he calls a working definition. He calls it an extraordinary event with an unusual supernatural cause, okay? And he calls it a working definition, and then in the next couple paragraphs he goes on to explain all the difficulties with this particular definition. But this is the definition he kind of works from, okay? And he acknowledges that it has limited usefulness, but there's a couple aspects of his definition that I want to point out. And one is he's talking about an event that we could call a singular event or an extraordinary event, okay? So it's singular, not in the sense that similar events haven't happened. So, for example, we see many examples of Jesus casting out demons, or many examples of Jesus healing the blind. So when I'm using the word singular, I don't mean that it only happened once, but what I mean is just a very extraordinary event, and that event supersedes natural law, and it supersedes natural causation. Notice I'm not using the word violate, okay? Similarly, he calls it a supernatural cause, okay? And I'm going to kind of hone that a little bit, and I'm going to call it an act of God. So you could have a supernatural cause which is demonic, or you could have a supernatural cause which is divine, okay? And so as I'm defining the word miracle today, as I'm using it today, I'm using it in reference to a divine act. Now, I want to be very explicit here. Well, I'll get back to that. So one of the aspects about a miracle is that as I'm defining it today, as I'm using the term today, is it serves in some measure as a sign. Okay, so this is one of the characteristics of a miracle. And there's several reasons why we say that, but one is one of the Greek words, the word dunamis, which is translated in the New Testament by English translators as miracle. The word means power, okay? But that word is that word power or miracle is often used in a context immediately followed by the phrase signs and wonders. So it'll talk about miracles, signs, and wonders, miracle signs and wonders. Okay, so it's frequently associated with this idea of signs and wonders. In addition to that, there's another Greek word, semeion, which is also rendered sometimes as miracle, but the word means sign. Okay, so both these words, this word power and the word sign, are translated by English translators, some English translators in various places in the New Testament, as miracle. Okay, so one of the things you see is that miracles are typically understood to have some kind of significance. They have some kind of, they are some kind of a sign, but that sign is dependent on the context in which the event occurs. So the event occurs in a particular context and conveys a sign. Okay, so the context of an event that you think about as a miracle is relevant. You have, in other words, to understand whether or not something is a miracle, to some degree, you have to understand the context in which it occurred. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to go back to here and point out is, as I mentioned, the word dunamis is sometimes translated as miracle. And there are places in the New Testament where that word is used in reference to demonic activity. And there are places in the New Testament where translators translate it as miracle when it's talking about demonic activity. So in other words, there are really two kinds of miracles in the New Testament. There are miracles which are demonic, have demonic causation, and there are miracles which have divine causation. Okay. But today, in my use of the word miracle, I'm only talking about the second part. I'm only talking about the divine causation, and that's what I am defending today, okay? So on this idea of context, the context of the miracle is important, or we don't see the significance, we don't see the sign. So take the example of the resurrection of Jesus. What if this man from Nazareth had been crucified by the Romans and rose from the dead, completely devoid of the highly charged spiritual context that we see it in? So if we remove the claims he made about himself, if we don't have his predictions about his life and, that he makes about his death and his resurrection, if we don't see his conflict with the religious rulers, if we don't see the reasons for his, if all that context in which his death and resurrection occur is removed from the story, and all we have is a man who dies and rises from the dead, we see no significance in the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, we would have no reason to believe it's even a miracle. It would just be to us some kind of bizarre phenomenon. Okay, so the context in which an event occurs is crucial in determining whether or not it's a miracle. And then it's kind of helpful too to think in terms of, think about miracles in relationship to nature, because particularly in the scriptures, we see it kind of done two ways. Sometimes you get this kind of unnatural, supernatural event, but somehow nature plays a role in bringing it about. So an example would be in the story of the opening of the Red Sea, the scriptures tell us that a great wind came in and opened the sea. Now we view it as a miracle, all right? But yet the scriptures do tell us that there was some kind of natural phenomena that assisted in this miracle. Another example would be when that strange story when Jesus takes some dirt and he spits in his dirt in his hand and he makes a mud and then he smears it on a guy's eyes and the guy gets healed, right? You know, commentators are all over the map trying to figure out what Jesus was doing there, and I have no clue what Jesus was doing there, but it's an example of God sometimes using natural things in carrying out a miracle. On the other hand, we see events in which miracles occur just completely independent, apparently, of any normal involvement of natural things. So Elisha floating of the axe head, or the virgin birth, or things that just, they don't seem to have any kind of natural participation in the miracle. So you get those two different kinds of miracles, but they're both miracles. Now, so we're talking about this divine origin, or this supernatural origin. So what this means is that a denial of the possibility of miracles philosophically assumes that a theistic God does not exist. Okay, so for someone to insist that miracles cannot happen, they have to insist there is not a theistic God. Okay, so they may be an atheist, they may be a deist, they may be a pantheist. Okay, but they can't, you can't consistently say there's a theistic God. Remember, a theistic God is not only a God who creates, but a God who is involved in the ongoing operation of the universe. And if there is such a thing as a theistic God, then miracles are possible. So in one sense, somebody who's going to argue that miracles are impossible has to first argue there is no God. Okay? Because if a theistic God is possible, then by definition, miracles are possible. And then we see in Scripture, we see three uses of miracles. There may be more, but there are particularly three that stand out to me. One is miracles are used to authenticate a divinely approved message or messenger. So the disciples of John the Baptist is in prison. He wants to know if Jesus is the one, if he's the Messiah. And so he sends his disciples to Jesus and they ask, are you the one? Our master wants to know, are you the one? And what does Jesus do? Well, he actually goes about his business of performing a number of miracles while they're standing there watching. And then he turns to them and he says, okay, now you go to John and you tell him what you saw. You saw these miracles. Okay. So Jesus is using the miracles to authenticate his message and to authenticate that he is a divine messenger. The second thing is we see that God uses miracles to express his concern for his people or to act on behalf of his people. So we see numerous examples, of course, of that, the crossing of the Red Sea and numerous other examples. And then thirdly, we see that miracles are used to testify of God's concern for people who are outside of his people, for others that are not believers or not in his family, that he wants to be in his family. And so oftentimes he will do miracles as a sign to unbelievers to cause them to trust the message and the messenger and to draw them to himself. So those are kind of the three main uses that we see of miracles. So what are the arguments that as a Christian, when you're rubbing shoulders with people in the world, what are the arguments that they're going to raise against miracles? And there are a number, but primarily there are 7. The first is, we've talked about some of these, and a lot of times when somebody is giving you these arguments, they don't know it, but actually what they're doing is they're just repeating Hume on some of these. But the first one would be a miracle would violate the unchangeable laws of nature. The second is science, which is the knowledge of nature and the knowledge of its laws and cause and effect and that sort of thing, disproves the possibility of miracles. The third is miracle claims run contrary to universal human experience. Okay, so this, of course, is Hume's argument. So you can never have credible evidence. And only non-scientific people, barbarous, primitive, unscientific people, believed in miracles because they didn't understand, they didn't know the laws of nature. And so, of course, they would believe miracles happen because they didn't know that the laws of nature made it impossible. Okay. Number 5 is a miracle claim would require extraordinary evidence to be believable. So, okay, if miracles were, if they were possible, I would really need some kind of really extraordinary evidence to believe it. Okay. Number 6 is, given the many obvious bogus miracle claims that are out there, and there are, millions of them, we shouldn't believe any miracle claims. There's all these bogus claims out there, so we shouldn't believe any miracle claims. So many of them are bogus, obviously bogus. And then kind of related to that is Hume's argument that, Well, you get miracle claims from competing religions. So you have these competing religions, and various religions that really are in competition with one another are all claiming miracles. And so therefore, we shouldn't believe the miracle claims that are associated with Christ or with Christianity. Okay. So let's take those one at a time, as much as we have time, and go through them. Okay. So number one is, do miracles violate the laws of nature? All right. Well, one of the things we need to do is we need to think about how is the word law used, and it's used in primarily two ways. The first, it's used in a prescriptive sense or a legal sense, okay? So we have laws about how fast you can drive, and we have laws about what you can do with your property, and we have laws now about who you can associate with and how many people can associate. You know, we have laws that are prescriptive. They tell us how we must behave, and if we don't conform to those laws, we have violated them. And this is where the idea of violation comes in. Violation has to do with disobeying a prescriptive law, okay? But then law is also used in a descriptive sense, and this is how it's used in science, okay? So the laws of nature, the scientific laws, if you will, are laws that describe the way we see nature operating, okay? So the question is, are miracles violations of the laws of nature? Well, the laws of nature are descriptions that are arrived at inductively. So remember, a deductive argument, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, as we talked about. An inductive argument, the conclusion follows probably from the premises, right? Well, the laws of nature are descriptions that are arrived at inductively by our observations of nature. So we observe that when you drop a ball, it falls, and it falls at a certain accelerating rate, et cetera. And we do it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And inductively, we arrive at the conclusion that if I do it again, it's going to do it the same way, okay? But that comes inductively, probabilistically, not certainly. And I don't know for certain that if I do it the next time, it will. I only know it inductively, okay? From my observations. But what if I observe a miracle? If I observe a miracle or a miraculous event, how could that be a violation of the laws of nature? Because the laws of nature come from my observations. So what I'm learning here is that miracles are not a violation of some kind of prescriptive law, but rather miracles are an event which operates not in the way that I normally expect nature to operate. So it in some way supersedes nature, but it doesn't violate nature, okay? So let's explore that some more. So we believe, of course, that God transcends the laws of nature. So somebody only violates laws to which they're subject. But we don't believe that God is subject to nature. We believe actually that he transcends nature. In fact, we believe that he actually sustains nature. And he's actually sustaining the laws of nature. It's what Colossians tells us. It's what Hebrew tells us. Okay? So God is not subject to the law of nature. He is the source of the laws of nature. All right? So that would mean that he's free to intervene in just the normal cause and effect aspects of nature. So he acts, and then the new situation immediately behaves according to the laws of nature. So it's not like God overthrows the laws of nature. He acts, he intervenes, he supersedes the laws of nature momentarily, and then immediately the laws of nature take effect again. I'll elaborate more on this in a minute. So the laws of nature are neither violated nor are they overthrown, right? And thinking then in terms of divine action, if, as science points now, as we talked about in our study the origin of the cosmos, if you can have a first singularity where God is acting before the laws of nature, why would we expect that God is limited to only one singularity? Why can he only create the cosmos, but at any other time in the future of the cosmos, he isn't free to act? So Lewis has a really kind of cool quote that I like on this question of God violating the laws of nature. He says, if God annihilates or deflects or creates a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. Immediately, nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in her realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws. And 9 months later, a child is born. I think that's a beautiful portrayal of what a miracle is. It's a one-time singular event which occurs, and then immediately it's enfolded and enwrapped in all the laws and regularity of nature. Okay. The second charge is that science disproves the possibility of miracles. But of course, from our study of science, we know that science, as science, is limited simply to the knowledge of the natural world and natural cause and effect, right? So that means that science is incapable of assessing the cause of a particular singular event that has divine causation, because there's, if you will, there's a wall or there's a fence around science beyond which science knows nothing. So it can't go beyond that and say there is no divine causation. Now, science may point outside the wall, as we see with, for example, scientific evidence for the origin of the cosmos. It may point outside the wall, but it can't speak to anything outside of the wall. So science is not in a place philosophically to address, or scientifically, to address whether or not there is divine causation. So Keener says this. He says, scientists are experts about the normal happenings of nature. But when asking whether something outside the norm happens, they no longer speak as scientists per se, because how to address anomalies or metanormal phenomena is a philosophical or theological question, okay? And he's using anomalies there in the sense of miracles and things like that. So he's just making that point that science really can't speak to whether or not miracles are possible. So the claim that science denies the possibility of miracles is not a scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim, okay? And it's just simply repeating David Hume's presuppositions, okay? It's not based on science. The third question is, are miracle claims contrary to universal human experience? So, of course, William Paley refuted this argument on logical grounds. He just pointed out that the argument presupposes what it seeks to prove, okay? So it's a circular argument. It's an argument that begs the question, okay? In addition, Paley went on to demonstrate that it is possible to have credible witnesses to miracles. And in fact, we know that there's a vast amount of evidence across the world throughout history up into the current century of evidence for miracles. So, for example, Greg Keener, I told you about his 2-volume work, okay? And just chapter after chapter after chapter, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph in his 2 volumes, he is just documenting, I don't know the number, but it's got to be 1,000 or in the thousands of documented miracles throughout history and around the world and up into contemporary history. He demonstrates that miracles are occurring today and that many of them have been scientifically documented, medical records and that sort of thing, okay? And on that point, let me just mention that he also establishes that there are parts of the world, Africa, Iran, China, where the Christian church is growing at just an astonishing rate. And he points out from the testimony of missionaries and people on the field that one of the primary causes of the rapid growth of the gospel in those parts of the world is miracles. When my daughter was living in China, I was interacting with her on this issue, and I said, is that your experience in China? And she said, absolutely. That's what they're seeing in China, is that miracles are having a profound impact on the growth of the church in China. So one of the questions that we would ask as Americans is, well, why do we see so few miracles? If everybody else is seeing them, why do we see so few of them in the West? Okay. And there are a couple primary reasons. One of them is more general, and then one of them applies specifically to the West. But one of them is miracles are by definition rare. Okay. If they weren't rare, they wouldn't serve as a sign. So you're on a strange road. You're driving down a strange road, and every 50 feet, you see one of those yellow diamond signs with the black curve on it telling you there's a curve. And you see one of those every 50 feet, regardless of what's ahead on the road, okay? So you're driving for several miles, and eventually you come to one, and there actually is a curve back there. You don't know it, but why would you believe it? Because you've been getting a sign every 50 feet that there's a curve, right? So it's the same principle with miracles. If one of the purposes of miracles is to be a sign, the only way they can be a sign is if they are rare, okay? And then the other issue about miracles is if miracles happened all the time, many, many times a day, we wouldn't be able to rely on the constancy of nature. So we wouldn't even be able to get up in the morning because we wouldn't know, if we rolled out of bed, if we'd be able to stand up. We wouldn't be able to eat our food because we wouldn't know if it was going to nourish us or poison us. Okay. So you have to have this just unrelenting constancy of nature or you can't function, you can't live. All right. But that's generally true across the world. What about in the West? Why in the West? Well, I would say that since the Enlightenment in the West, we have this kind of bias against the supernatural, okay? That's not shared in what Keener calls the majority world, the non-Western world, okay? So we have this kind of Enlightenment view of the supernatural that is not shared by the majority world. And because faith plays a crucial role in many miracles, not all miracles, and Keener's very clear in pointing this out, and he gives examples of miracles that occurred where a person was not believing, okay? But generally speaking, miracles, there's an element of faith involved in miracles, right? But here in the West, we have this kind of deeply seated suspicion about the supernatural. We're just very highly dubious about the supernatural and miracles. And I would suggest that this is true not only with unbelievers, but it's even true in the church. I think many of us as Christians are just deeply suspicious of miracles. So we know God does miracles, and sometimes we pray he does a miracle, we ask him to do a miracle, but we don't really think he's going to do it, right? Because we just have this kind of inset skepticism regarding miracles. But think about Jesus when he went to Nazareth. What happened? So Jesus returns to Nazareth at one point, and he's been doing miracles all over the place. And there have been places, there have been cities, once he was in Capernaum, and he says he healed everybody that came to him. He was just healing and healing and healing. But when he was in Nazareth, it said he healed a few people and he left, and that's all he could heal. Why? It said because of their unbelief. So I would suggest to you that one of the reasons that we don't see more miracles in the West, I think one reason is they happen and we're not seeing them because we don't have eyes of faith. But I think another reason is they're not happening at the rate. It doesn't appear that they're happening. They are happening, and Keener proves that. They are happening in the West, but they're not happening at the rate that they're happening in the majority world because of our unbelief. So I think that's an explanation that to me goes a long way in explaining why we don't see more of it. The fourth question is, do only primitive and barbarous people believe in miracles? This is obviously false on the face, okay? Primitive, pre-scientific people, you know, in ancient times, as much as primitive people today, understand the almost exceptionalist regularity of nature. They know how nature acts. Their whole life is based. Primitive people living much closer to nature than we do clearly understood the regularity of nature. And they knew that people don't walk on water. And they knew that people didn't rise from the dead. Think of Zacharias. Okay, so here's a priest. This is a guy who believes God. This is a guy who believes in miracles. But an angel, he sees an angel, folks. He sees an angel. And the angel tells him that his wife is going to bear a son. And what's his response? I don't believe it. So this idea that primitive people are just this kind of gullible people that will just believe anything because they don't understand the laws of nature is just patently false on the face of it. Miracles were viewed as miracles by primitive people specifically because they understood the constancy and the regularity of nature. That's why they were so astonished at miracles. Because if they didn't understand the regular nature, they wouldn't have been astonished. Oh, yeah, well, no what? No, so what? Of course this can happen. But they know that that's not the case. So this argument that only primitive and barbarous people believe in miracles is clearly false. So think about the feeding of the 5,000, the changing of water to wine, the raising of Lazarus. In all of these situations, you just get this astonishment on the part of the peoples because they know these are clearly not natural events. Do miracle claims require extraordinary evidence? And this is a frequent response that you'll get from people. They'll say, well, extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. That's the way it's sometimes put. The more generic way that it's put is somebody says to you, well, I'm not going to believe in a miracle unless I really see some kind of spectacular evidence, right? The problem with this is the requirement is just highly ambiguous. So if somebody says to you, well, I really need some extraordinary evidence to believe in miracles. You can ask them, well, what would account for extraordinary evidence to you? What would you consider to be extraordinary evidence? And usually they're going to hum and haw around and try and figure out, well, what is something that would be evidence for me that would not in itself be a miracle? And it's very, very difficult to come up with something. So in reality, sometimes I think what's happening here, sometimes people just heard this excuse or this reason, and so they're using it. But I think what lies behind oftentimes is it's a skeptic's way of saying it doesn't matter how much evidence you give me, it's not going to be enough to convince me. That's kind of, I need extraordinary evidence, but they won't define what that extraordinary evidence is for fear that God will give it to them, and then they'll have to believe a miracle. So it's really their way of saying, it doesn't matter how much evidence you give me, I'm not going to believe. Okay? Well, in reality, the evidence that's cited for a miracle doesn't need to be extraordinary. It just needs to be more explainable by a miracle than by a non-miracle. So, for example, I'll try to get through this story. It's pretty emotional to me. But 2 or 3 years ago, I was working on a job out west of Purcell, about 10 miles out west of Purcell, a rural area. And at lunchtime, I took my lunch break. I went, sat down in my truck, ate lunch, and then I put the recliner back, and I was going to take a nap. And so I laid back, just take a lunchtime nap. And during this nap, I had a dream. Meanwhile, my wife was driving back from Iowa, and she had been up there for the birth of one of our grandchildren, and she was driving back from Iowa, trying to be home for the Good Year's Eve service that evening. Good Friday service. And so I'm lying there taking this nap, and I have this dream. And in this dream, I see my wife in a vehicle headed for a horrific accident. She's clearly going to crash, and it's going to be this terrible accident. And it's so real to me, it wakes me up. I just startled awake. And, it takes me a few moments to kind of think through it. What did I just dream? And then realize Mary's on the highway up on I-35. And so I thought, I've got to pray. And so I prayed, and I just said, God, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why I had this dream, but I just pray you'd protect my wife. I pray you'd watch over her and keep her safe and keep her from any accident. And that's all. And then I got up from lunch, and I went back to work. And a couple hours later, or 3 hours later, whatever, my wife called and got me on my cell phone. And she told me how she had been driving just somewhere north of Kansas City, and she had encountered a horrific thunderstorm, so much so that she had basically lost visibility in the car. And it was just a really scary, one of those kind of thunderstorms you get out here in the Midwest, And she had somehow managed in the blindness of this storm to find an exit and get off the exit and get to a restaurant or a filling station or whatever and go in and wait out the storm. And she told me this story. And then I asked her, Mary, when did that happen? And it turns out that it happened right at the moment that I was praying for her. Now, what explanation are you going to give for that? How much evidence do you need that that was a divine, supernatural act of God? I don't need something writing in the sky. I don't need another miracle. It's just the simple reality that my wife told me a true story, and I believed her story, and it coincided with what I knew to be real, and that's all the evidence I have. To me, I understand clearly it was a miracle. Okay. So the point is, you don't need an overwhelming amount of evidence. The question is, what's the best explanation for the evidence that you have? Is a miracle the best explanation, or is a non-miracle the best explanation for the evidence that you have? And Craig points this out in his book. He says, what is crucial is that the evidence be far more probable, given that the event did occur, than given that it did not occur. The bottom line is that it doesn't always take a huge amount of evidence to establish a miracle. And the resurrection is a classic example of this. And we'll see this when we get into our study of the resurrection later in our apologetics year in August. As we look at the resurrection, we'll see this, that there are just a number of events that are just better explained. And there's a bunch of evidence just better explained by a miracle that Jesus did rise from the dead than by any other kind of explanation of what happened. Okay? So we really don't need a ton of evidence, folks. We just need reliable, credible evidence that is best explained by a miracle. Do bogus miracle claims invalidate all miracle claims? Well, a bogus claim is no evidence against a real thing, okay? Anything bogus. So, you don't see any bogus $3 bills, right? You might see a bogus $20 bill, but you're not going to see a bogus $3 bill. Why? Because people seek to imitate. If they're wanting to do evil or misrepresent something, they try to misrepresent what we know is real, not what's not real, okay? So we don't have any obligation, just because there are bogus miracle claims out there, to believe them. And it's just absurd to say so. But what bogus claims do mean is that we need to be careful to evaluate the evidence for the claim, right? We need to think about, is this really a miracle, or is it an anomaly, or is it You know, is it magic, or what is it? You know, or is it really a miracle? We do need, on the other hand, as I mentioned, as the New Testament points out, there are miracles which are demonic. Okay, so in that case, we have to ask ourselves the question that Moses asked the people regarding prophets. He gives them two criteria for prophets. One is that what they prophesy needs to come true, but there are some cases of false prophets who prophesy things that come true. So the second criteria is it has to lead them to God and not away from God. So one of the ways we evaluate the credibility of a miracle claim and whether it's a bogus claim when it comes to demonic things, is it leading us to God or is it leading us away from God? And then the seventh question we mentioned is, do miracle claims of other religions disprove or call into question the miracle claims from Christianity? Okay. And there are kind of three things that we need to think about in regard to miracle claims in other religions. One is, we really don't have any reason to assume that God would never have a reason to do a miracle for somebody in another religion. Okay? We kind of assume God would never do a miracle for a Muslim, or God would never do a miracle for a Hindu, or even for an atheist. Okay, but why do we assume that? We don't really know that for sure, do we? And in fact, God may have some reason that we don't know, but He has a reason that He's doing a miracle. Remember, He has various reasons why He does miracles, and so He may have reasons that we're just not aware of. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is, you know Christians, and you've maybe done it yourself. I've probably done it myself, where we look at some of these other kind of unusual events and we call them miracles, right? Well, it's possible that people in other religions are doing the same thing. They're seeing unusual events and they don't really have an explanation for them. They don't know why they're caused, and so they attribute them to miracles, okay? They just simply may be misinterpreting other kinds of unusual events. And then, of course, the third possibility is always that there's demonic activity at work. They really are supernatural events, but in the case of false religions, they're leading them away from God rather than to God. So these would be examples of kinds of situations where somebody in another religion may be making a miracle claim, and that's no reason to dismiss the miracle claims of Christianity, right? Just very quickly then, just kind of run through what we've talked about today. A miracle claim is an act of God which momentarily alters the normal operations of nature and which inspires awe and serves as a sign. We also saw that miracles occur within a religious context which sets the stage for its significance. What is it a sign of? Miracles are not contrary to science, but they are beyond science. Miracles could happen and did happen in history, and miracles can and do happen today all over the world, and are actually a primary cause of the gospel's success in many places today, particularly in the majority world. And then we saw that just given reasonable evidence criteria, as long as we have just some kind of reasonable criteria for our evidence, it is possible to know with a high degree of confidence that a miracle has occurred. So knowing these things then, this all of course pertains to our lives today and our prayer lives today and situations that we face today. But of course, all of this has very clear bearing when we get to the reliability of the New Testament documents, the reliability of the testimony of the New Testament documents, the life of Jesus, and those sorts of things. All of these things come to bear. So when we get into the life of Jesus, we'll come back and touch some on this issue of miracles because, of course, it's so crucial to just the basics of the Christian faith. So next week, we're going to move on into our module then, as I said, on authority or the Bible. And we will spend several weeks exploring why we believe the Bible is the Word of God. How did we get the Bible? Why do we accept these particular books and this particular Bible and no other sacred text? Why do we exclude those? Do we have reason to trust the text we have, or has it been corrupted? And on and on. There are just a number of questions that we'll be wrestling with. So before we go, are there any questions from our lesson today? Okay, well, Trinity's worship service is going to start in about 5 minutes or so on Facebook, so I encourage you to join us for that. So God bless y'all. We'll see you next week.